Jackson Jennings had exactly one thing on his mind as he rushed out of the auto repair shop, picking up his 6-year-old daughter, Mia, from school before she started thinking he had abandoned her. Again. He was already running late, thanks to a stubborn engine that refused to cooperate, and now he had to sprint to his truck, praying traffic wouldn't make things worse. But just as he reached the driver's side door, a loud crash echoed from across the street. His head snapped up just in time to see a cyclist tumbling onto the pavement, their bike skidding several feet away. Without hesitation, Jackson bolted toward the scene. The woman on the ground groaned, trying to push herself up, but her knee buckled, and she collapsed again. Hey, don't move too fast," Jackson said, kneeling beside her. She had long, dark hair tied back in a ponytail, and her face was contorted in pain. "Are you hurt anywhere besides your leg?" She winced, gripping her knee. "I think it's just my leg, and my pride," she muttered. Jackson let out a short laugh, relieved she was at least conscious and talking. "I'm gonna help you up, all right?" He gently slid an arm under hers, effortlessly lifting her to her feet. She gasped sharply, clinging to his shoulder. Okay, bad idea," she breathed. "That hurts." "I'll get you somewhere to sit," he said. "My truck's right over there." She didn't argue, which told him she was in more pain than she was letting on. He scooped her up before she could protest, carrying her across the street like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Not exactly how I imagined my afternoon going," she mumbled. Jackson chuckled. "Yes, well, I wasn't planning on playing hero today either." Once they reached his truck, he carefully set her on the passenger seat. "Do you want me to call someone? A friend? An ambulance?" She shook her head. No ambulance, but could use a ride to a clinic. Jackson hesitated. He was already late to pick up Mia, but he couldn't just leave this woman stranded. He exhaled sharply. "All right, I'll take you. Just give me a second." He pulled out his phone, dialing the school. "Hi, this is Jackson Jennings, Mia's dad. I'm running a little late. Can you let her know I'm on my way?" A pause. "Thanks." When he turned back, the woman was watching him curiously. "You have a kid?" "Yeah, 6 years old. She's gonna be mad at me for being late," he admitted as he started the truck. She smiled slightly. "Kids are good at keeping us accountable." "Tell me about it." As he drove, she shifted in her seat. "I'm Odette Grant." "Jackson," he said. "Nice to meet you, considering the circumstances." Odette laughed softly. "Yeah, not my most graceful moment." They reached a small clinic within minutes. Jackson parked and rushed around to help her out, ignoring her half-hearted protests. Inside, a nurse quickly took Odette back, leaving Jackson in the waiting area. He glanced at the time. Mia was probably sitting in the school office, swinging her legs impatiently, waiting for him. Guilt settled in his chest. After what felt like forever, Odette emerged on crutches, a soft brace wrapped around her knee. "Nothing serious," she said. "Just a bad sprain." "Good to hear." He stood, rubbing the back of his neck. "Listen, I need to go pick up my daughter, but I don't feel right leaving you without a ride. I can drop you off." Her eyes widened slightly, as if surprised by the offer. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said simply, "but I will." Odette hesitated, then nodded. "All right, that's really kind of you." They drove in silence for a moment before she spoke again. "You said you were late to pick up your daughter. What do you do?" Jackson sighed. "I run an auto repair shop. Well, run might be generous. It's not exactly thriving." Odette tilted her head. "Is it just you?" "Mostly. My dad used to run it before he passed. I took over, but business is slow, and raising a kid alone isn't cheap." She studied him, something unreadable in her expression. "You're a single dad." "Yeah, Mia's mom left when she was 2. Haven't seen her since." Odette frowned. "I'm sorry." Jackson shrugged. "It is what it is." When they reached her apartment building, Odette turned to him. Thank you, Jackson, really. Anytime, he said, meaning it. She hesitated, then smiled. Maybe I owe you lunch sometime. Jackson chuckled. I won't say no to free food. Odette gave him one last look before stepping out of the truck, disappearing into the building. As he drove off, he shook his head, half amused, half bewildered. He'd never expected to spend his afternoon rescuing a stranger, and yet, something about Odette lingered in his mind longer than it should have. What he didn't know was that he hadn't just helped any woman, he had helped Odette Grant, CEO of one of the most powerful tech companies in the city. And she wasn't going to forget him anytime soon. Jackson hadn't expected to see Odette again. After dropping her off, he had rushed to pick up Mia, bracing himself for her inevitable disappointment. She had narrowed her eyes at him, crossing her small arms in a way that reminded him too much of her mother, but after a few jokes and a promise of ice cream, she had let it go. The next few days had been business as usual, long hours at the shop, balancing bills, and making sure Mia had everything she needed. He had barely thought about Odette, aside from the occasional flash of dark eyes and the way she had looked at him when he had carried her to his truck. But he dismissed it. She was a stranger, and he had done what any decent person would have done. That was the end of it. Until the black town car pulled up in front of his garage. Jackson had been elbow-deep in grease, working on a stubborn transmission, when the sleek vehicle rolled into his lot. The kind of car that didn't belong in a shop like his, too polished, too expensive. He wiped his hands on a rag, stepping out from under the hood just as the back door opened. Odette stepped out, leaning slightly on her crutches. Jackson blinked. He had never seen her in anything besides the casual workout gear she had been wearing the day of the accident. Now, she was dressed in a tailored navy blue outfit that screamed wealth and power. Her hair was smooth and styled, not a strand out of place. Everything about her was sharp and put together, completely at odds with the woman he had scooped off the pavement. Well, this is unexpected, he said, tossing the rag onto a nearby workbench. Odette tilted her head. You didn't think I meant it when I said I owed you lunch. He chuckled, figured you were just being polite. She took a few steps closer, her gaze sweeping across the shop. Is this your place? Yes, been in my family a long time. She nodded, something thoughtful flickering in her expression. Then she gestured toward the car behind her. I wasn't joking about lunch. If you're free, I'd like to take you somewhere. Jackson hesitated. He wasn't exactly dressed for a nice restaurant, his shirt was stained with oil, and he probably smelled like gasoline. But something about the way she was looking at him made it clear she wasn't going to take no for an answer. Give me 10 minutes to clean up, he said. Odette smiled. 15 minutes later, they were seated in a restaurant that Jackson would have never stepped foot in on his own. The kind of place with white tablecloths and waiters who looked like they had been trained to judge people like him. He felt out of place, but Odette didn't seem to care. You don't talk much about yourself, she said after they had ordered. Jackson shrugged, not much to tell. She arched a brow. You're a single dad running a business on your own. Say that's something. He leaned back, watching her. What about you? You never told me what you do. Odette hesitated, as if weighing her words. Then she set down her glass and met his gaze. I run a company, a tech firm. Jackson nodded slowly. That explained the car, the clothes, the way she carried herself like someone used to being in charge. And you ride a bike to work. She laughed, shaking her head. No, I was just trying to clear my head that day. He watched her for a moment. So, why are you here? Odette tilted her head. Told you I owed you lunch. That's not what I mean. She smiled, but there was something behind it, something he couldn't quite figure out. Because I wanted to see you again. Jackson wasn't sure how to respond to that. He wasn't the kind of man women like Odette sought out. He wasn't polished, wasn't rich, wasn't anything close to the men he imagined filled her world. But she had come to find him anyway. Over the next few weeks, Odette kept showing up. Sometimes it was a quick visit to the shop, bringing him coffee and sitting on the hood of a car while they talked. Other times, it was a late afternoon lunch, where she listened to him rant about customers who didn't pay on time or the stress of keeping the business afloat. She never acted like she didn't belong. Even when his employees stared at her like she was a mirage. And then there were the moments with Mia. Jackson hadn't expected Odette to take an interest in his daughter, but one evening, when she stopped by the shop and Mia was there, something shifted. Mia had been sitting on an old stool, doodling in a notebook, when Odette approached her. "What are you drawing?" Mia had glanced up, studying Odette for a long moment, before flipping the notebook around to show her a messy sketch of a car with wings. Odette grinned. "A flying car, that's pretty genius." Mia had brightened immediately, launching into an explanation of how the wings would work, and Jackson had watched in silent amazement as Odette listened intently, asking questions like she actually cared. Maybe she did. One evening, as Jackson wiped down the counters in the shop, Odette leaned against the doorframe. "You ever think about expanding?" she asked. He glanced at her. "Can't afford to." She crossed her arms. "What if you had the resources?" Jackson frowned. "What are you getting at?" Odette hesitated, then stepped closer. "See how hard you work, how much you care about this place. About Mia, you deserve a chance to make this easier on yourself." Jackson set down the rag, his jaw tightening. "I don't need charity." She sighed. "It's not charity, it's an investment. You have the skills, Jackson, you just don't have the means, but I do." He exhaled slowly. "Why do you care so much?" Odette held his gaze. "Because I know what it's like to build something from nothing. I know what it's like to fight for something you love." Jackson studied her for a long moment. He wasn't sure what she was offering: help, opportunity, maybe something more, but the idea of taking anything from her felt dangerous. Because the more time he spent with Odette Grant, the harder it was getting to ignore the way she made him feel. Jackson didn't like owing anyone anything. So when Odette offered to invest in his shop, he had shut it down immediately. He wasn't about to be someone's charity case, no matter how many cups of coffee she brought him or how easily she fit into his world. But Odette wasn't the kind of woman who took no for an answer. "You're being stubborn," she told him one evening as they sat outside the shop, the sun dipping low over the horizon. "This isn't about pity, Jackson, it's about potential." He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "And what do you get out of this?" Odette leaned back against the hood of his truck, studying him. "Maybe I like seeing good people win. Maybe I like knowing had a hand in something real." He narrowed his eyes. "You don't invest in people like me, Odette. You invest in companies that make headlines." She tilted her head, considering him. "Maybe you're the exception." Jackson didn't know what to do with that. So he did what he always did. He focused on the work in front of him, the bills that needed paying, and the little girl who depended on him. But Odette didn't disappear. She kept showing up, not just at the shop but in his life. One evening, he had just finished making dinner when there was a knock at the door. Mia ran ahead of him, flinging it open before he could stop her. Odette stood there, holding a bag of takeout in one hand and a cautious smile on her face. "You look tired today," she said simply. "Figured you could use a break." Mia gasped dramatically. "Is that from the fancy noodle place?" Odette nodded. "Extra dumplings, too." Mia yanked the door open wider, looking at her father expectantly. "Can she stay?" Jackson sighed, but there was no real fight in it. Might as well come in. That night, he watched as Odette sat at his worn wooden table, listening intently as Mia chattered about school and her latest obsession with space. She wasn't just polite, she was engaged, asking questions, laughing at Mia's jokes, treating her like she mattered. And Jackson felt something shift. He wasn't sure what to call it yet, but it was there. Days passed, then weeks. Odette became a fixture in his life in a way he hadn't expected. She never pushed, never demanded, but she was there. Steady, unwavering. One night, after Mia had fallen asleep, Jackson and Odette sat on the porch, the air thick with the scent of summer rain. "You're making this hard," he admitted. Odette glanced at him. "Making what hard?" "Keeping my distance." She looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in her eyes. Then, she reached over, her fingers brushing lightly against his. "Maybe you don't have to." Jackson stared at her, his heart hammering in his chest. He had spent so long keeping walls up, making sure no one got too close. But Odette had slipped past them without him even realizing it. And now, he wasn't sure if he wanted to push her away or pull her closer. Jackson wasn't sure when it had happened. Maybe it was the way Odette had slid so seamlessly into his life, never demanding, never pressing, just existing in a space he hadn't realized needed filling. Maybe it was the way she listened to Mia, to him, to the quiet things he never said out loud. Or maybe it was the way she made him feel like he wasn't just surviving, like life could be something more than working late nights and worrying about bills. But it had happened. He had fallen for her. And now, as they stood in the dim glow of his porch light, her fingers barely brushing against his, Jackson knew there was no going back. Odette exhaled softly, her eyes searching his. "You're trying so hard to fight this." Jackson's jaw tightened, "Because it doesn't make sense." Her lips curved, not in amusement but in understanding. "Love rarely does." The word hit him like a punch to the chest. Love. He had spent so long keeping his heart locked away, convinced that love was something reckless, something that only led to heartbreak. But with Odette, it didn't feel reckless. It felt terrifying, yes, but not because it was dangerous, because it was real. Jackson reached up, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You live in a different world, Odette." She stepped closer, her voice steady. "And yet, I keep ending up in yours." He let out a slow breath. "I don't know how to do this." "You don't have to," she said. "We'll figure it out." Jackson hesitated for only a second longer before he gave in. He closed the distance between them, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that felt like the culmination of every unspoken word, every stolen glance, every moment they had spent dancing around the inevitable. Odette melted into him, her hands gripping the front of his shirt as if she never wanted to let go. And for the first time in a long time, Jackson let himself believe that maybe he didn't have to keep holding the world up on his own. Maybe, for once, he could let someone in. Mia noticed before Jackson was ready for her to. She had been watching him carefully for days, the way kids did when they sensed something was different. And then, one morning, as he packed her lunch, she leaned against the counter, arms crossed, her face scrunched in deep thought. "You like her," Mia announced. Jackson nearly dropped the knife he was using to slice an apple. "Who?" Mia rolled her eyes. "Odette." He sighed, setting the knife down. "How do you know that?" Mia grinned. "Because you look at her the way Uncle Mike looks at his pizza, like you're in love." Jackson groaned. "That's the worst comparison I've ever heard." Mia giggled, then her expression turned serious. "Is she staying?" The question caught him off guard. He crouched down so he was at eye level with her. "What do you mean?" Mia shrugged, suddenly looking smaller than usual. "People don't always stay." Jackson's chest ached at the quiet vulnerability in her voice. He hated that she had learned that lesson so young. He brushed a hand over her curls. "Odette isn't going anywhere." Mia studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good, I like her. Jackson smiled. Yeah, me too. The next time Odette came over, Mia didn't give her a chance to knock. She yanked the door open before Odette's hand even reached the wood, grinning up at her. You're late, Mia declared. Odette arched a brow. Late for what? Mia grabbed her hand, dragging her inside. Movie night. Dad makes the worst popcorn, so hope you brought snacks. Odette laughed as she let herself be pulled toward the couch. I might have something in my bag. Jackson watched them from the kitchen, a warmth settling in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, his house didn't just feel like a place to sleep. It felt like a home. Months passed, and Jackson stopped questioning it. He stopped wondering why someone like Odette had chosen him. Stopped waiting for her to wake up one day and realize she belonged in a world far away from his, because she never did. She was there for the late nights at the shop, sitting on the hood of a car, listening to him talk about things he never thought anyone would care about. She was there when Mia lost her first tooth, celebrating like it was the biggest event of the year. She was there when money was tight, not offering handouts, but standing beside him, reminding him that he wasn't alone. She was there. And then, one evening, as they stood in the garage after closing, Jackson turned to her, his hands stuffed in his pockets, and said the words that had been sitting on the tip of his tongue for weeks. I love you. Odette stilled, her eyes widening slightly. And then, slowly, she stepped closer, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. I love you too, she whispered. Jackson exhaled, pressing his forehead against hers. I don't know what I did to deserve you. Odette smiled, brushing her lips against his. You were you. And just like that, Jackson knew this wasn't temporary. It wasn't fleeting. It was forever. The morning air was crisp as Jackson stepped outside, the scent of damp pavement lingering from the night's rain. It was early, too early for anyone else to be awake, but he had grown used to these quiet moments before the day began. The shop wouldn't open for another hour, Mia was still asleep, and for now, everything was still. He wasn't used to this feeling, this strange sense of peace. For years, his life had been a careful balancing act, keeping the shop afloat, raising Mia, making sure nothing slipped through the cracks. He had never allowed himself to slow down, to breathe, to think about what he truly wanted. But now, things were different. Because of Odette. She had settled into his life in a way that felt effortless, like she had always been meant to be there. And the more time they spent together, the harder it became to imagine a future without her. The sound of a car pulling up broke through his thoughts. He turned, expecting to see a customer dropping off their vehicle early, but instead, Odette stepped out of the sleek black sedan that had become familiar over the past few months. She was dressed simply today, a soft sweater and jeans, but there was something in her expression that made him pause. She looked uncertain. Jackson wiped his hands on his jeans as she approached. Didn't expect to see you this early. Odette hesitated for half a second before closing the distance between them. I needed to talk to you. His stomach tightened. That wasn't the kind of sentence that usually led to good things. She exhaled, glancing around the empty lot before meeting his gaze. Have to leave the city for a while. The word settled in his chest like a weight. How long? A few months, she admitted. There's a major acquisition happening and have to be in London to oversee it. It's not something I can do remotely. Jackson nodded slowly, trying to process what she was saying. He knew her world was different from his. He had never once asked her to choose between her career and what they had. But the thought of her being gone for months, of waking up without her showing up at the shop or sitting across from him at dinner, made something in his chest tighten. Odette reached for his hand. This doesn't change anything. I didn't want to leave without telling you first. He studied her for a long moment. You're coming back." Her grip on his fingers tightened. "Of course am." And somehow, that was all he needed to hear. The weeks leading up to her departure passed too quickly. Jackson tried not to think about how quiet things would be when she was gone. Instead, he focused on the moments they had together, the late-night talks, the stolen kisses in the garage, the way Mia had started referring to her as if she were already part of the family. They didn't talk about what would happen when she returned. There was no need. When the day finally arrived, Jackson drove her to the airport himself. Mia had insisted on coming, clutching a small drawing she had made of the three of them, stick figures with exaggerated smiles. Odette had promised to hang it in her office. At the terminal, she turned to Jackson, her expression softer than he had ever seen it. "You'll be okay." He nodded. "Yeah, but I'll miss you." Odette smiled, reaching up to touch his face. "I'll miss you too." Mia pulled her into a hug, holding on tight. "Don't forget to come back," she mumbled into Odette's sweater. Odette's voice was steady, but there was an emotion there Jackson hadn't heard before. "Never." And then she was gone. The first few days without her were strange. Jackson threw himself into work, fixing cars, managing customers, making sure Mia got to school on time. But there was an absence now, a quiet space where Odette used to be. Mia noticed it too. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table, she poked at her mashed potatoes, frowning. How many days until she comes back? Jackson glanced at the calendar. 74. Mia groaned. That's forever. He chuckled. Feels like it. They had never talked about what Odette was to them, not really. But Mia had accepted her presence as easily as he had. And that was when Jackson realized something. She wasn't just someone he loved. She was part of their family. Months passed. They talked as often as they could, late-night phone calls filled with exhaustion and longing. Odette told him about boardrooms and contracts, about the city lights of London and the rain-soaked mornings. He told her about the shop, about Mia's latest obsession with learning to bake, about how things weren't the same without her. But no matter how many calls they had, it wasn't enough. He needed her here. And then, one evening, she called him earlier than usual. Her voice was lighter, filled with something he hadn't heard in a while. "I'm coming home." Jackson's heart kicked against his ribs. "When?" 2 days. He exhaled slowly, letting the words settle. "Good, because I don't think I can do 74 days again." She laughed, and for the first time in months, everything felt right again. When Odette stepped off the plane, Jackson and Mia were waiting. She barely had time to drop her bag before Mia launched herself into her arms, squeezing tight. Jackson stood back, watching the two of them, something warm settling in his chest. And then Odette looked at him. Everything he had felt over the past few months, the longing, the frustration, the overwhelming need to have her close, rose to the surface. He didn't care that they were in an airport, that people were rushing around them. He crossed the space between them, pulled her into his arms, and kissed her like he had been waiting his whole life to do it. Odette melted into him, hands gripping his shoulders, her breath shaky when they finally pulled apart. "Missed me," she teased. Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "You have no idea." And just like that, everything was right again. Because she was home. Jackson never thought he'd be the kind of man to plan a proposal. But as he stood in the middle of his shop, staring at the small velvet box in his palm, he realized he had never wanted anything more than to ask Odette to be his forever. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind since she returned. She had slipped back into his life as if she had never left, yet something was different now. Stronger. There was no more hesitation, no more cautious steps around what they were. they were together. Fully, undeniably together. Mia had taken to Odette's return as expected by demanding she never leave again. And Jackson, he had woken up every morning with the quiet certainty that this was it. She was it. He had never imagined himself as the kind of man who could give a woman like Odette the life she deserved. But she had never cared about any of that. She had chosen him over and over again, and now it was his turn to prove that he would do the same. The only problem, he had no idea how to propose. "You're overthinking it," Mike said, leaning against the workbench. "Just ask her." Jackson shot his friend a glare. "I don't want to just ask her. I want it to be right." Mike shrugged. "You love her, she loves you. That's all that matters." Jackson sighed, gripping the ring box tighter. He wanted it to be special, something Odette would remember forever. But how did you come up with a grand gesture for a woman who had everything? Then it hit him. Maybe it wasn't about grand gestures. Maybe it was about them. That night, he made a call. The next evening, Jackson pulled up in front of Odette's building, stepping out of his truck just as she emerged from the lobby. She arched a brow. "You're early." He grinned, holding out his hand. "Come with me." Odette glanced at him, curiosity flickering across her face, but she didn't hesitate. She took his hand, letting him lead her to the truck. As they drove, she studied him. "Are you going to tell me where we're going?" "Nope." She laughed, shaking her head, but didn't press. When they finally arrived, she blinked in surprise. "The shop." Jackson helped her out of the truck, leading her inside, but it wasn't the usual cluttered space she was used to. Tonight, the garage was transformed. String lights hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the space. A table sat in the center, candles flickering against the metal walls, and in the background, soft music played from an old speaker. Odette turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Jackson." He took a steadying breath. "This is where everything started, where you walked into my life, completely unexpected." She smiled. "Fell into your life, literally." He chuckled, stepping closer. "And I wouldn't change a second of it." Odette's eyes softened, searching his. Jackson swallowed hard, reaching into his pocket. "I never thought I'd get this," he admitted. "A love like this, a life like this. But you made me believe in something bigger than just getting by. You made me believe in us." Odette's breath hitched as he dropped to one knee, flipping open the box. "I don't care about the differences between our worlds. I don't care about anything except the fact that I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt that." Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes shining as he held up the ring. "Marry me, Odette." She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "yes." Jackson barely had time to slide the ring onto her finger before she pulled him up, crashing her lips against his. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, and for the first time in his life, he knew with absolute certainty. This was where he was meant to be. The wedding was everything they never knew they wanted. Mia stood proudly between them as they exchanged vows in a quiet ceremony. The shop transformed once again, this time into something out of a dream. Odette was breathtaking in a simple but elegant dress, her eyes never leaving Jackson's as they promised forever. And when they kissed, sealing their future, the world around them faded, leaving only them. Years later, Jackson stood outside their home, watching Mia chase their youngest son across the yard, her laughter ringing through the air. Odette stepped beside him, resting her head against his shoulder. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" she asked softly. Jackson smiled, wrapping an arm around her waist. "I think I knew the moment you crashed into my life." Odette laughed, tilting her face up to kiss him. And as their children's laughter filled the air, As the sun set over the life they built together, Jackson knew this was the greatest thing he had ever done. And he would choose her in every lifetime.